What's up, my fellow adult collectors, and welcome to Surveying Collectibles. One question I get asked almost every single time I introduce my collection to a new person is, how long have you been collecting? Well, this image here kind of gives you an idea. The short answer to that question would just be my entire life, or that I've just never stopped. In some way or another, collecting has always been a part of me. While the figure all the way to the left is, in actuality, the McFarlane Toys version of the Superpowers Superman, this lineup is meant to represent each decade I've been collecting. The 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and the current 2020s. So, my goal for this video is to answer that question in depth. I intend to show you the toys I grew up with, the ones I owned in the past, and how that led me to what I collect today. If this is your first time on my channel, hi, my name is Seville, and here I'd like to discuss action figures and other collectibles based on my favorite movies, TV shows, and video games. If you find this video enjoyable or informative, please give me a thumbs up, don't forget to subscribe, and hit that notification bell. My history with collecting starts in the 1980s. That's when I was born. I had two older brothers growing up. The oldest one, Jimmy, was more into the G.I. Joes, the Star Wars, Star Trek, while the younger one, Charlie, was into the DC superpowers, Superman, Batman. He had the Batmobile with Robin. In fact, we both had our own individual Darkseid figures because I started to have trouble sharing. I think we had the Hall of Justice, but I'm not really sure because most of this stuff was considered his and not mine, even though I'd still play with like the Superman, the Batmobile, the Lex. All those I played with a lot. As Charlie got older, though, he was definitely one of those who thought that as a teenager you should be done with toys and superheroes and all that stuff, so he ended up selling off most of his. Going back to the thing about me having trouble sharing, though, I apparently really had that problem when it came to the Knight Rider toys, especially the Kenner voice car. I don't remember this, but there's a story my sister told me about how when my brother first got the Kenner voice car and pulled it out of the box, I immediately grabbed it and basically stole it from him. It was gotten to the point that it was so bad that he could not play with it in front of me because I was going to want to play with it. This is one of the few toys I actually still have from my childhood. I know for a fact that I was actively still playing with it well into the 90s. Unfortunately, the voice thing died long ago. The car has been broken, glued together, re-glued together, and glued together some more. At this point, I'm pretty sure the only thing holding it together is the super glue all over the car. If you've been following my channel for a while, then you know that wrestling was a huge part of my childhood. My dad was a fan, Charlie was a fan, so me and him both had a lot of the big rubber figures as well as the ring that went with them. With this, we did share a bit more than we did with Superpowers, in that we'd play together. We shared the ring, but we each had our own figures. Like, I had Hulk Hogan, he had Junkyard Dog. Or I had Roddy Piper, he had Big John Studd. Because we'd always play with each other and against each other, that sort of thing. With all that said, now we'll start getting into the toys that were really the beginning of me having toys just for myself. I was a huge fan of both Ghostbusters movies and the cartoon. I had the entire Fright Features line, as well as both versions of the Ecto-1, all of the role-play toys, and especially the Firehouse. Then the next big franchise for me was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I struggled so much getting a complete set of any of these. I never really did as a kid, like each character was from a whole different set. Michelangelo, he was the only original I had. And then Raphael was like the kind where the shells opened to store weapons in. Leo was the kind that had a little band that you'd run through him to make him talk. Donatello was the Mutagen wave where it transformed from baby turtle to big turtle. It's kind of crazy back in those days. I did end up having the original Party Wagon as well as the Sewer playset, but then even with the bad guys, the figures were all over the place. Like, I had the original Shredder and Rocksteady, but Bebop was a mutation version, and some of the other characters were just kind of mixed in from different lines all throughout the series. And then, of course, to cap off the 80s, I did have a lot of toys based on the 1989 Batman movie. I remember basically having everything from the main line for that. Batman himself, Joker, Bob, the Batmobile, the Batwing, Joker's motorcycle, even the Batcave. Pretty much everything you'd need to recreate that film. Moving into the 1990s, This is where I really started to ramp up and expand my childhood collection. With having so much trouble ever getting a complete set of the original Ninja Turtles, when they started doing the movie star lines, I was really hyper focused on trying to get every single one of these. Of course, I'm a kid, so I didn't have a whole lot of power, but I was asking for them as gifts in every possible scenario till I eventually got the entire line. Of course, they never actually made the Party Wagon or the Sewer playset for the movie specifically, so I just ended up playing with that stuff along with these figures. Around this time, I did just barely start to get introduced to the Marvel characters. Like, I knew who Hulk was from the old TV show, but didn't have a clue who the X-Men were before the animated series. I'd kind of heard a little bit about Spider-Man here and there through my oldest brother, Jimmy. He was really into the comic books, especially in the Todd McFarlane era. So between him showing me the comics and then me watching the animated series, that really got me into collecting Spider-Man stuff. Probably had most of that line, but then with the X-Men, I only had like a few figures here and there. Back to DC though, when it came to the further Batman movies, I really only used those lines to add in the new characters. Catwoman and Penguin from Batman Returns. I did have that Transforming Bruce Wayne too though. I didn't like to have a lot of the weirdly multicolored Batman figures, but if the suits did update in the actual movies, then I did buy those figures, like the Val Kilmer suit here, and of course I had the new characters like Robin, and then when he changed to the more Nightwing style suit, I bought that figure. And of course, you still had Poison Ivy, Mr. Freeze, Two-Face, Riddler, all those other new characters that came later on. Of course, I can't talk about the 90s without mentioning the Kenner Superman line. I pretty much had about 90% of what you'll see here. In fact, you know from the beginning of this video, I still have that long-haired Superman. I'm one of those kids whose first true introduction into reading comic books was The Death of Superman. So the very first time I ever laid eyes on this set, knowing it was the only way to get a Doomsday figure, was the first time I ever really begged my mom to buy me something that was over $5 on just a random shopping trip. As far as the rest of this line goes, I never really did get either of the vehicles, but I do still have that 12-inch Ultimate Superman and the Kryptonian Battlesuit. I did also collect a little bit of the JLA and Total Justice lines, but I really only remember having the Electric Superman Blue and Superman Red, as well as Darkseid. I know earlier I stated that I've never really gotten into the 3 3/4 inch figures because I just feel like they're too small for me, but the one line in the 90s that made me break that rule was Mortal Kombat. I remember having everything you see here except Shang Tsung's boat. I was always so disappointed that I could never find that for myself. After the 1995 movie, they even re-released a lot of the figures with cloth goods over the bodies, but they had some weird repaints though, like Scorpion suddenly had a blue mask. Another franchise about to hit its 30th anniversary this year, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I had the same problem with Power Rangers that I did with Ninja Turtles. I was unable to ever actually complete the original first wave. I had Jason and Zack as the first wave, but then I didn't get Billy and Trini until the Karate Chop action figures. And then Kimberly, I didn't get her until the shiny chrome movie versions. With that being the case, I'm mostly focused on the smaller 5-inch figures like the automorphin ones with the flip heads or the ones with the bikes in order to complete a single team. As a kid, I never had the original Zords from Season 1. I did eventually buy them from friends later on who were giving up the toy collecting hobby, but my first actual Zord I purchased for myself was the Red Dragon Thunder Zord, and then when the movie came out, I did finally get the Ninja Mega Zord, but of course, that's just not quite the same as having the original. Moving right along though, my introduction to Spawn was the movie itself, and these figures were so badass for the time. These were the ones that really got me into the movie and lifelike detail of the figures that we have today. I made sure to add every single piece of this line to my collection, whether it's the variants of Spawn himself, the deluxe figures like Violator and Malbolgia, everything. Of course, later on we know this kind of leads into movie maniacs. Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, all those horror characters were kind of spawned from the Spawn movie line. I did have a few of the movie maniacs figures like Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, the Terminator, but to this day my absolute favorite McFarlane movie figure is the Headless Horseman from Sleepy Hollow. I never actually found this figure at retail myself. It was actually gifted to me years later by my buddy Brian LeBlanc, who is actually responsible for drawing the Lionhead logo that I use on this channel. With all that said though, we're going to cap off the 90s by going back to wrestling, specifically to the Monday Night War era, WCW versus WWF. I was more of a WCW NWO guy during this time, so that was the bulk of my collection. I had that ring, most of the WCW figures, but then I also had the WWF Titantron and a lot of the figures that worked with that, like Undertaker and Kane. Moving on to the 2000s, this is when a lot of toy companies started using articulation as a major selling point. When Marvel kicked this off with the Spider-Man Classics line, I had to buy the whole set. Of course, this eventually leads to the Marvel Legends line, which I did buy some here and there, but when they started doing the Build-A-Figure stuff, that's when I really dove in heavy. I had the whole Galactus wave, the whole Sentinel wave. I was also really heavy into the movie figures at that time as well. The first X-Men movie figures weren't really all that great. Same with the Fantastic Four movies, but by the time you got to the first Spider-Man movie and the X2 series, then they were starting to show more signs of being more like the Marvel Legends. Then, as Hasbro took over the Marvel license, I started to switch my focus entirely over to the movie figures rather than any of the comic book characters. Over time, I did end up selling all the comic book versions to my friends or on eBay, things of that nature, until I whittled it down to just movie characters. Back to the DC side, though, once Mattel took over the license and started doing the DC Superheroes line that eventually leaned into the DC Universe Classics lines, there wasn't really enough movies going on, much less movie figures, for me to make that shift with DC. So I was sticking to the comic book style characters and had pretty much all of them. There was very few I was really missing. Around the same time, Jazzwares got a hold of the Mortal Kombat license and started making some pretty well articulated and detailed figures based on Deception and Shaolin monks. Again, I pretty much had this entire line, with the exception of one or two figures that were Comic-Con exclusive. By the time the TMNT 2007 movie came out, I hadn't really kept up with the franchise in a while, but I finally caught it once it was on DVD, and by then all the figures were on clearance or in salvage stores, so I ended up going back and finding them all. But it just wasn't something I jumped into at first, but got good deals and everything, ended up still getting the entire line. Outside of wrestling rings and arena props, this was probably the last place that I've ever bought. Speaking of wrestling, by this point, the WWE figures had gotten to the Classic Superstars line, which eventually led to the Deluxe Classic line, and then the Deluxe Aggression lines. The set you see here is the last one I ever bought from Jakks, because when they got into the Deluxe Aggression stuff, every single figure was pretty much exactly the same. Kane shared the same body as guys like Shawn Michaels, Chris Jericho, and Rey Mysterio. I wasn't necessarily a huge stickler for scale, but there needed to be at least some differences. So once they started doing that, I dropped off the wrestling figures altogether. At least until 2010. That's when Mattel took over the license and has had the Elite Collection rocking and rolling ever since. As they became more and more prominent, I sold off all previous wrestling figures and stuck to just Mattel. This is around the time when I started really hyper-focusing on just figures based on movies, TV shows, and video games. I started running out of room. If I was buying everything, then I didn't have anywhere to put it. I was leaving stuff stored in boxes. I was cramming up the shelves so tight you couldn't see anything. So that's when I made the decision to stick to one per character or something like that. When I got the Dark Knight Rises Batman, I didn't need the Kenner Batman anymore. So that's when I began to sell off all my old childhood toys and just keeping the more modern ones. By this point, the toy industry as a whole was realizing and recognizing that adult collectors like us were a huge part of the market. The Power Rangers Legacy line came out. That allowed me to sell off all my old Power Rangers. The Legacy line is a great example of something that was clearly targeted just for the adult collectors. Figures, weapons, Zords, all that stuff in very high quality. I still have the Legacy Zords because I don't really feel like the Zap Zords are worth the current price tag, but as far as the figures go, I have swapped entirely to the Lightning Collection. The NECA Ultimate line led me to replacing most of my Movie Maniacs figures because these have the same level of detail but with better articulation. Much like in the same way, Storm Collectibles led me to replacing all of the Jazzwares Mortal Kombat figures. Then finally, because of the 6-inch Black Series figures, this is when I started diving into the Star Wars line for the first time. Which in turn brings us to the current decade. Now, the lines I currently have modern collections for from Hasbro are the Power Rangers Lightning Collection, MCU Marvel Legends, Ghostbusters Plasma Series, and the Star Wars Black Series. From Storm Collectibles, I have Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Tekken, and DC's Injustice. From McFarlane, I also have DC as well as Mortal Kombat. With NECA, you have the Ultimate line of various movie figures, as well as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movies 1 and 2. And finally, from Mattel, the only thing left is WWE. So with all that said, now you can see where I got my start and how that led me to where I am now. If you want a closer look at anything in my current collection, be sure to go back and check out my recent tour videos. I have one just for Hasbro and one for everything else.